the assumption is that they will come to an agreement and raise that debt ceiling before they default on any of their payments. But as an economist, it'll be really interesting to see if that doesn't happen. My name is Dr. Rebecca Johannsen. I am an economics instructor here at PCC. So in the United States, there is legal limits on how much money the U.S. government can borrow. The debt ceiling started back in 1917. It used to be that the U.S. government, anytime they wanted to borrow money, Congress would have to pass a new bill for that specific amount of borrowing. But as World War I and World War II started happening, they were borrowing money more frequently. They decided instead of having to create a bill every single time they wanted to borrow money, they would create a debt ceiling, which is essentially a credit limit for the government. They would decide a maximum amount that it was okay for the government to borrow without having to go back and request not an extension, but an increase. So if you have a credit card, you might have a $1,000 limit on your credit card. If you spent all of that, you've reached your limit, you want to spend more than that, you might have to go to your credit card company and say, hey, can you increase my limit? And that's kind of what the debt ceiling is in the United States. And so every time they reach that limit, they've essentially spent all of the money they're legally allowed to, or borrowed all of the money they're legally allowed to, and they have to go back to Congress to get permission to borrow more money. And generally, when the economy is having a recession, you're naturally going to have more spending than there is tax revenue, especially if you want to stabilize the economy or stimulate things so that the recession ends faster. At least in the short run, it's a good thing to have the government borrow money. It helps the economy get out of that. But the U.S. has a pattern of having more spending than what they're bringing in income every single year, whether there's a recession or not. So it's called deficit spending. They just always spend more money than they bring in. Yes, so the U.S. government sets its budget, its annual budget, based on what it wants to spend, and there's no requirement that they have to collect that much money in tax revenue. So anytime the government tax revenue is lower than the amount they're spending, they have to borrow money to cover the excess. So in 2022, for instance, they collected about $4.9 trillion in tax revenue, or their government income, but they spent $6.2 trillion. So that extra $1.3 trillion, they had to issue government debt or U.S. Treasury securities to borrow that money to be able to pay for that spending. Currently, the debt ceiling is at $31.4 trillion. So that is the current outstanding debt that they owe. If you had a credit card, you owed $31 trillion on your credit card, that's essentially what it's like. The debt has gone up about 40% since 2019. So it has gone up a lot. It was about $22 trillion before COVID, and now we're at $31.4 trillion. So a huge amount of the debt has been accrued just in the last few years. Lots of different people. So about 60 to 70% is domestic, meaning pension funds, retirement accounts, individual households and investors. Lots of big investment banks buy U.S. government debt. Some foreign countries do as well because it's considered a safe investment. And so if you're trying to reduce your risk and make the most money, you want to have some safer investments. And so U.S. debt is considered a safe investment. Japan, I think, owns the most of our debt at about $1.3 trillion. And then I think China might be next. But most of it's actually internally held by retirement accounts and internal domestic people and companies. Potentially, the danger with raising the debt ceiling is that people may lose confidence in the U.S. government and their ability to pay it back. So currently it's considered a safe investment because we assume that the government can pay it back. But if their borrowing becomes too high, it may be more and more difficult for them to be able to meet those interest payments and meet those debt obligations. Right now, they're spending almost $500 billion a year on interest payments on their debt. And partly they have a very low interest rate because it's considered a safe investment. But if they default, meaning they don't pay some of that back, then that interest rate's going to go way up. It's going to be very expensive to finance all of this outstanding debt, and it's going to limit the government's ability to pay for other services and things that they currently spend money on. It will depend. There's no necessarily list in order of what's going to get cut. There's certain things that are more likely to get cut sooner than other things. But yeah, a lot of that funding would have to stop. They may have to start resuming student loan payments or other things to start collecting more money. But yeah, it will impact people who are getting subsidies or financial aid or any sort of funds from the federal government for sure. So there's different things that can happen. If they don't raise the debt ceiling, their option is to spend less money, right? Or collect more taxes, or they could quit paying some of their bills. So it's a little bit tricky in the current year because they have certain legal requirements for spending based on the budget they passed last year. And so what it would usually mean is defaulting on payments or not making a payment. So they have an interest payment due, let's say in June. And if the debt ceiling isn't raised and they haven't brought in enough tax revenue, then they just wouldn't pay that back. And that would cause a whole bunch of chaos in the financial markets. It would affect everybody's retirement accounts in the US, and it potentially could cause a recession in the US. So raising the debt ceiling in the short run is helpful because it's going to prevent some of those immediate problems. But having too much outstanding debt that just continues to grow and grow could potentially make US debt a riskier investment if people lose confidence in the government. Right now, if you look at some of the investment markets, it doesn't seem like investors are worried about this. So it looks like the assumption is that they will pass a bill to increase that debt ceiling to continue borrowing. But all of the different politicians are going to be using this as leverage to try to get some of their bills passed or other things they may want in the future, because it does require cooperation between Democrats and Republicans to get this passed. It really just depends on if it becomes a problem or not. So far, at least in recent, decades, it hasn't caused problems in the U.S. economy. It hasn't caused significant inflation. It hasn't been limiting growth too much. So as long as it's not causing problems and people still keep buying the debt as much as we issue, they probably will continue just raising it and borrowing more money. Especially considering the interest rates they're paying are so low. When they pay that money back in the future, it's with cheaper dollars than what they borrowed. And so it could potentially be a good, at least short-term investment plan for the government. But if it does start causing problems, if people lose confidence in the US government, if interest rates go up, or it starts causing too much inflation, then they'll definitely rethink those plans.